At 11:47 p.m., Richard Ashford was worth $3.2 billion. By sunrise, he had nothing. Not a single dollar. Not a single friend. But there was one person still standing in that empty mansion when the sun came up. And who it was, will break your heart. Richard Ashford didn't just live in luxury. He was luxury. Penthouse overlooking Manhattan. Private jets. A yacht named Invincible. At 42 years old, he built Ashford Technologies from a garage startup into a tech empire that changed the world. Everyone wanted to be near him. His business partner, Edward Cunningham, stood by his side at every gala, every board meeting, every victory. His fiancée, Amanda Sterling, a stunning former model, wore a 12-carat diamond ring and planned a wedding that would cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. His younger brother, Gilbert, managed the company's West Coast operations, living off Richard's generosity and success. Life was perfect. Until Tuesday, October 17th. Richard was in his office, 67 floors above the city, when his assistant Rose rushed in. Her face was white. "Mr. Ashford, the SEC just issued a statement." Richard barely looked up from his laptop. "About what?" Rose's voice cracked. "About you, sir. They're saying Ashford Technologies has been involved in massive fraud. Stock manipulation. Insider trading. Money laundering." The words hit him like a physical blow. "That's impossible. Sir, it's all over the news. Every major network. The stock is crashing. The FBI is downstairs." Richard stood up so fast his chair flew backward. He turned on the TV. And there it was. His face. On every channel. Tech billionaire Richard Ashford accused of $2 billion fraud. His phone exploded with calls. Edward. Amanda. Gilbert. His lawyers. His board members. He answered Edward first. "Ed, what the hell is happening?" Silence. Then Edward's voice, cold as ice. "I don't know, Richard. But I can't be associated with this. I'm resigning from the board effective immediately. My lawyers advised me to distance myself. Ed, we've been partners for 15 years. Edward hung up. Within 3 hours, federal agents froze every account. Every single one. His personal accounts. His company accounts. His investments. His properties. All assets seized pending investigation. By midnight, Richard Ashford stood in his $40 million penthouse, watching his life disintegrate on live television. Amanda walked in from the bedroom, suitcase in hand. "Amanda? Where are you going?" She didn't look at him. "I can't do this, Richard. My father's already getting calls from reporters. This will destroy my family's reputation. You're leaving. Now." She finally met his eyes. They were cold. "I fell in love with Richard Ashford, the billionaire. Not Richard Ashford, the criminal." She pulled the engagement ring off her finger and set it on the marble counter. "Goodbye." The door closed behind her. And Richard stood alone in the darkness. At 2:47 a.m., the power went out. Even the utilities had been cut off. Richard sat on the floor of his living room, surrounded by darkness, his phone dying, the city lights below mocking him through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He'd lost everything in less than 12 hours. But that was only the beginning. When the sun rose, Richard discovered just how alone he really was. His brother Gilbert's number went straight to voicemail. No callback. His assistant Rose sent a brief email, "I've accepted a position elsewhere. Best of luck." His lawyers. They dropped him the moment his retainer account was frozen. Every friend he'd ever made, every person he'd helped, invested in, supported, vanished like smoke. The penthouse was being seized. He had 48 hours to leave. Richard packed what he could carry in a single duffel bag. Designer suits felt ridiculous now. He grabbed jeans, t-shirts, his laptop. As he left the building for the last time, the doorman who'd greeted him with a smile every morning for 8 years looked right through him. Like he was invisible. Like he'd never existed. Richard tried to check into a hotel. Declined. His credit cards were frozen. He went to Edward's house in Connecticut. They'd been friends since college. Brothers, almost. Edward's wife answered the door. "He's not here, Richard. And, he asked me to tell you not to come back." "Did he really say that, Hester? Or is that you talking?" She looked uncomfortable. "Richard, I'm sorry. But we have children to think about. We can't be involved in, whatever this is." The door closed. For 3 days, Richard stayed in a budget motel on the edge of the city, paying in cash from the $340 he'd had in his wallet. He barely ate. Barely slept. The news was relentless. Ashford's empire built on lies. Investors lose billions in Ashford collapse. Former tech titan faces 30 years in prison. The world believed he was guilty. And the evidence against him was overwhelming. Documents. Emails. Transactions. All with his digital signature. His lawyers, before they quit, told him it was airtight. Prosecutors had a mountain of proof. But Richard knew the truth. He hadn't done any of it. Someone had framed him. And he was about to find out who. What happened next destroyed him. Richard spent his days in that motel room, digging through every file, every email, every document he'd saved on his laptop. There had to be something. Some clue. On the 5th day, he found it. A pattern in the fraudulent transactions. Every single one had been approved through a secondary authorization protocol, a backup system only 3 people in the company had access to. Richard. Edward. And Gilbert. His heart stopped. He checked the timestamps. The locations. The IP addresses. Every fraudulent transaction traced back to Gilbert's login credentials. His own brother had destroyed him. Richard's hands shook as he called the one person who might still listen, Pearl Chen, Ashford Technologies' former head of cybersecurity. She'd retired 2 years ago, but she was brilliant. "Pearl, it's Richard." A long pause. "I saw the news. I didn't do it. I need you to believe me. I need your help. Richard. Please. Just look at this data. 5 minutes of your time." She sighed. "Send it over." 2 hours later, Pearl called back. "Richard, you're right. These transactions were routed through sophisticated laundering protocols, but the authentication tokens all originate from Gilbert's executive access. And there's something else." "What?" "There are communication logs between Gilbert and Edward going back 9 months. Encrypted. But I broke in. Richard, they planned this together." The room spun. "What?" Edward wanted full control of Ashford Technologies. He approached Gilbert with an offer, help him frame you, and they'd split the company. Edward would take it public under new leadership, make billions. Gilbert would get 20% ownership. Richard couldn't breathe. "My brother. My best friend. They used you, Richard. They spent months setting this up. Fake transactions. Planted evidence. They even bribed an SEC investigator to fast-track the case against you." Richard sat in that motel room for hours, staring at nothing. Betrayed by his own blood. Betrayed by the man he'd trusted more than anyone. Everything he'd built. Everything he'd sacrificed. Stolen. That night, Richard walked to the Brooklyn Bridge. He stood at the railing, looking down at the dark water below. He had no money. No home. No future. Everyone he'd ever loved had abandoned him. What was the point of fighting anymore? He gripped the cold metal railing. And then, through the wind, he heard a voice. Don't. He never saw it coming. Richard turned around. Standing 20 feet away was a woman he barely recognized at first. Tenna Morrison. She looked different than he remembered. Older. Tired. She wore a janitor's uniform, holding a trash bag. Tenna. She walked closer slowly, like approaching a wounded animal. I work the night shift. Clean the walkways on the bridge. Saw you standing there. Richard's voice broke. You shouldn't. I'm not worth saving. Tenna set down her trash bag and walked right up to him. Do you remember me, Richard? Of course. You worked at Ashford Technologies. 10 years ago. Marketing department. 12 years ago, actually. You gave me that job when no one else would. I was a single mother with a GED and no experience. You took a chance on me. Richard looked away. Yeah, well. That man doesn't exist anymore. That man is standing right in front of me. Tenna gently took his arm and led him away from the railing. They sat on a bench. The city lights flickered across the water. I saw what happened to you, Tenna said quietly. I saw the news. And I know what it's like to lose everything. You don't understand. My husband died when my daughter was 2, she interrupted. Cancer. Medical bills destroyed us. I lost our house. Our savings. I lived in my car for 6 months. Worked 3 jobs. People I thought were friends disappeared. Richard looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. I didn't know. Why would you? You were building an empire. But that job you gave me, it saved my life. I worked my way up to senior project manager. Made enough to give my daughter a good childhood. Sent her to college. Tears streamed down Richard's face. They took everything from me, Tenna. My brother. My best friend. They destroyed me. I know. I have nothing. I am nothing. Tenna grabbed his face with both hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. You are not nothing. You are more than your money. More than your company. More than what they did to you. Then what am I? You're the man who saw potential in a janitor on a bridge. Tenna took Richard back to her small apartment in Queens. A modest 2-bedroom. Photos of her daughter everywhere. You can stay here, she said. Guest room's not much, but it's warm. Tenna, I can't. Yes, you can. And you will. Because right now, you need help. And I'm giving it to you. Just like you gave it to me. Richard broke down completely. For the first time since this nightmare began, someone had shown him kindness. Real kindness. Not because of what he could give them. But because of who he was underneath it all. Over the next 3 weeks, Tenna became Richard's lifeline. She shared her food. Let him use her computer. Sat with him when the darkness became too much. She helped him contact Pearl again. Together, they compiled evidence of Gilbert and Edward's conspiracy. It was a long shot, but it was something. One night, Tenna came home late from her shift and found Richard at the kitchen table, surrounded by printouts. What's all this? She asked. Richard looked up. His eyes had life in them again. Purpose. Evidence. Enough to prove I was framed. Pearl cracked Edward's encrypted communications. We have everything. That's incredible. I'm taking it to the FBI tomorrow. A new investigator, one Edward didn't bribe. This could work, Tenna. She smiled. But Richard's expression grew serious. I need to ask you something. Why did you help me? Really? You could have just walked away that night on the bridge. Tenna sat down across from him. Do you want the truth? Please. Her answer changed everything. Tenna took a deep breath. Richard, do you remember 12 years ago, when you hired me? Of course. Do you remember what you said during my interview? Richard shook his head. You asked me why you should hire someone with no degree and no experience. And I told you the truth. I told you about my husband. About my daughter. About being homeless. Tears filled Tenna's eyes. And you looked me in the eye and said, the world measures people by their resumes. I measure them by their fight. And Tenna, you're still fighting. That's all I need to know. Richard's throat tightened. You changed my life that day, Tenna continued. But that's not the only reason I helped you. Then why? Tenna stood up and walked to a drawer. She pulled out a faded photograph and handed it to Richard. It was a picture of a young girl, maybe 7 years old, standing next to a hospital bed. In the bed was a man with tubes and machines around him. Who is this? Richard asked. That's my husband. James Morrison. 6 months before he died. Richard studied the photo. Something about the man's face. And this, Tenna said, pulling out another photo. This is James when he was younger. Before the cancer. Richard's hands began to shake. Because he recognized the man in the second photo. No. James was a Marine, Tenna said softly. Deployed to Afghanistan in 2009. His unit was ambushed. An IED explosion. He was badly injured, but someone dragged him to safety. Saved his life. Richard couldn't breathe. That person was a young Marine named Richard Ashford. The room spun. You. Richard whispered. James Morrison. I remember him. He saved 2 other guys before he got hit. I pulled him to cover. Anyone would have done the same. But you did it, Tenna said, tears streaming down her face. You saved my husband. You gave me 8 more years with him. You gave my daughter a father to remember. Richard stood up, overwhelmed. I never knew. I never connected. Your last name. I took my maiden name back after James died. Started over. But I never forgot you, Richard. When I applied to Ashford Technologies, I didn't even know you were the CEO until I saw you in the interview. Why didn't you tell me? Because you already saved me once. And you'd forgotten, which meant you didn't do it for recognition. You did it because that's who you are. Richard sank into a chair, his entire worldview shattering and rebuilding. All these years, you knew. I knew. And when I saw you on that bridge, ready to give up, I thought, not this man. This man doesn't quit. This man saves people. Even when he's the one who needs saving. Tenna knelt in front of Richard. You asked me why I stayed. That's why. Because you stayed for my husband. You stayed for me when you gave me that job. You stayed for everyone you ever helped. Now it's my turn to stay for you. Richard wept. Not from sadness. From something deeper. From the realization that the life he'd built, the money, the power, the success, none of it mattered compared to the simple act of being human. Of helping someone when they needed it most. He'd saved James Morrison not because he was a billionaire, but because he was a Marine who saw a brother in need. He'd hired Tenna not because she had credentials, but because she had heart. And now, when he'd lost everything that the world valued, he'd found the one thing that actually mattered. A connection that transcended money or status. A debt of the soul, repaid with loyalty that couldn't be bought. But the fight wasn't over yet. The next morning, Richard and Pearl walked into the FBI's New York field office. This time, they had an appointment with Special Agent Carolyn Grant, a senior investigator known for her integrity. Richard placed a folder on her desk. Agent Grant, my name is Richard Ashford. I'm here to surrender myself and to expose the people who actually committed the fraud I was accused of. Over the next 3 hours, they presented everything. Pearl's forensic analysis. The communication logs between Gilbert and Edward. The bribed SEC investigator. The timestamps proving Richard was locked out of his own systems when the fraudulent transactions occurred. Agent Grant listened carefully, took notes, asked sharp questions. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. Mr. Ashford, this is compelling evidence. I'm going to need some time to verify everything, but if this holds up. It will, Pearl said firmly. Then we're looking at a conspiracy case against Edward Cunningham, Gilbert Ashford, and several others. Richard felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. The investigation took 3 months. During that time, Richard stayed with Tenna. He took a job washing dishes at a diner near her apartment. Minimum wage. Humbling. Honest work. Every day, he learned what life was like for people he'd never truly understood before. The single mother working 2 jobs. The elderly man stretching Social Security to cover rent. The college kid buried in debt just trying to survive. Richard had been a billionaire, but he'd never truly been rich. Not until now. Not until he understood what it meant to have nothing and still have everything that mattered. On March 3rd, Agent Grant called. Mr. Ashford, we've arrested Edward Cunningham and Gilbert Ashford. We have confessions from the bribed SEC official and 2 other conspirators. All charges against you are being dropped. Full exoneration. Richard closed his eyes. Thank you. There's more. The assets they stole from Ashford Technologies are being seized. You'll recover most of your company. It'll take time, but you're going to be okay. The news broke that evening. Billionaire Richard Ashford exonerated, betrayed by brother and business partner. Tech CEO framed in elaborate conspiracy, real criminals arrested. Within days, Richard was offered his company back. His penthouse. His accounts. His life. But Richard did something unexpected. He stood in the office, Rose had come back, apologizing profusely, and he made an announcement. I'm restructuring Ashford Technologies. 40% of the company's profits will go to a new foundation, the Second Chance Initiative. Supporting people who've lost everything. Helping them rebuild. And I'm creating an employee ownership program. Every person who works here will have stake in what we build together. Rose stared at him. Mr. Ashford, that's incredibly generous. It's not generosity, Richard said quietly. It's gratitude. 6 months later, Richard stood in a small community center in Queens. Tenna was beside him as they cut the ribbon on the Morrison Ashford Center for New Beginnings. A place where people who'd lost everything could find job training, housing assistance, counseling, and hope. Named after the Marine who taught Richard the meaning of courage. And the janitor who taught him the meaning of loyalty. That evening, Richard and Tenna sat on the same bench where she'd found him on the bridge. Do you ever regret it? Tenna asked. Giving away so much money? Richard smiled. I lost everything once. And you know what I discovered? The stuff I lost, the money, the status, the power, that wasn't everything. It was nothing. The people who stayed. The people who showed up when I had nothing to offer them. That's everything. I was a billionaire, Tenna. But I was poor. Now I actually have less money, but I'm richer than I ever was. Tenna rested her head on his shoulder. James would have been proud of you. I hope so. Because he's the reason I'm still here. Both of you are. Richard Ashford never got back to $3 billion. He didn't need to. He built something better. A life measured not by what he accumulated, but by what he gave. Not by who followed him in success, but by who stayed during failure. And years later, when people asked him about the night he lost everything, Richard would smile and say, "That was the night I found out who I really was. And who really mattered. Turns out, I didn't lose everything that night. I lost everything that didn't matter. And discovered the one thing that does. Loyalty isn't tested in success. It's forged in failure. And the people who stay when you have nothing? Those are your true riches." If this story touched your heart, I hope it reminds you of what truly matters in life. The people who stand by us not because of what we have, but because of who we are. Thank you so much for watching this story. Your time means the world to me. If this resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, emotional stories that will move you. Drop a comment below and let me know, have you ever had someone stay by your side when you had nothing to offer? Or have you been that person for someone else? I'd love to hear your story. Stay tuned for another incredible story coming your way soon. Until then, remember, true wealth isn't measured in dollars, it's measured in the people who stay. See you in the next one.